My name is Charlotte Hayes, and I'm 29 years old. I used to believe that love was the one place where cruelty could never reach me, the one sanctuary where judgment didn't matter. I grew up in a quiet town where people whispered politely and smiled even when they disapproved. But the night of my engagement, I learned something brutal. Sometimes the people who clap the loudest are the same ones sharpening knives behind your back. And sometimes the deepest humiliation happens in a room filled with champagne and fake smiles. The engagement party was supposed to be perfect. Soft golden lights drape across the garden, violins humming gently in the background, crystal glasses clinking like delicate promises of happiness. I wore a simple ivory dress, not too flashy, just elegant enough to reflect the calm joy I felt inside. Daniel stood beside me, nervous, but glowing with quiet pride. He wasn't the richest man in the room, nor the most charming, but he was honest, painfully, beautifully honest. And to me, that was worth more than every luxury car park outside that mansion. But Daniel didn't come from the kind of family that impressed my relatives. My parents had spent years building connections with influential people, attending charity galas, pretending wealth equaled worth. Daniel was a school teacher, soft-spoken, humble, and far too real for a room full of polished illusions. I noticed the glances immediately, the subtle smirks, the lifted eyebrows, the quiet murmurs behind manicured hands. They didn't even try to hide it. Their judgment floated in the air heavier than the perfume. Then it started. My cousin Victoria leaned toward another guest, whispering just loud enough for me to hear. A teacher? Charlotte could have married a CEO. But I suppose charity work runs in the family. A few chuckles followed. Quiet, controlled, poisonous. Daniel squeezed my hand gently, pretending not to notice. But I felt the tremor in his fingers. I saw the way his jaw tightened as he tried to smile. He was trying so hard to belong in a place that had already decided he didn't. The humiliation didn't stop there. My Uncle Richard raised his glass for a toast. But instead of blessing our future, he delivered a speech layered with mockery disguised as humor. Marriage, he said with a grin, is about balance. One brings the money, the other brings personality. Laughter erupted, echoing across the garden like breaking glass. My chest burned. My mother didn't defend Daniel. She simply adjusted her necklace and looked away, as if silence was safer than loyalty. That was the moment something inside me cracked. I watched Daniel's smile fade for half a second, just half a second, but it was enough. Enough to see the pain he tried to hide, enough to see how deeply their cruelty had cut him. He had never asked for wealth, status, or approval. He only asked for respect. And somehow, in a room filled with family, respect was the one thing no one was willing to give him. I slowly placed my glass down. The music continued. Conversations buzzed. No one noticed the storm rising behind my calm face. But I knew something they didn't. I wasn't the kind of woman who forgets humiliation. I was the kind of woman who waits, who listens, who remembers every word, every smirk, every insult carefully wrapped as a joke. And that night, I said one sentence that none of them were prepared for, a sentence that would quietly begin the end of their perfect reputations. The laughter around me blurred into a dull echo, like distant thunder before a storm. I could feel Daniel's discomfort beside me, the way his shoulders stiffened as though he wished he could simply disappear into the polished marble floor. My mother leaned toward one of her wealthy friends, whispering something that made them both glance at Daniel with pity disguised as politeness. I realized then, this wasn't just a celebration for them. It was an evaluation, a silent judgment of whether my future husband met their standards of prestige. And according to them, he had already failed. Victoria wasn't done. She approached us with her glass of champagne, her smile sweet enough to fool strangers, but sharp enough to cut family. Daniel, she said, tilting her head slightly, I heard teachers don't earn much, but I suppose love doesn't need luxury, right? Her tone was light, playful even, but her eyes held something colder, a challenge, a reminder that in their world, money was power, and power decided who deserved respect. Daniel nodded politely, swallowing the insult like bitter medicine. "I earn enough to live honestly," he replied softly. His dignity only seemed to amuse them more. Across the room, my father's business partners had gathered near the bar. I overheard fragments of conversation that made my stomach twist. Such a shame. Charlotte had potential. Beauty wasted on a man with small ambitions. Love fades quickly when bills arrive. Each sentence was a quiet stab, delivered with casual cruelty. They weren't shouting. They didn't need to. Their whispers were loud enough to poison the entire evening. And the worst part, they believed they were being reasonable. Daniel tried to change the subject, asking about the catering, complimenting the music, making an effort to keep the peace. He was protecting me, even while being humiliated. That was the kind of man he was. He didn't fight with arrogance. He endured with grace. But grace, in a room full of pride, often looks like weakness, and predators always sense weakness. My relative smiled wider, spoke louder, became bolder with every passing minute. Then came the final insult. My Aunt Eleanor approached with her usual dramatic elegance, placing a delicate hand on my shoulder as if offering comfort. "Darling," she sighed, loud enough for others to hear. "Marriage is a lifetime investment. One must consider stability." Her gaze shifted toward Daniel, measuring him as though he were an object placed on auction. "Passion is temporary. Security is permanent." The implication hung heavily in the air. She wasn't advising me. She was warning me that I had chosen beneath my status. Something inside me turned cold. I looked around at the polished smells, the expensive dresses, the carefully curated perfection. All these people who claimed to love me, yet couldn't respect the one person who made me happiest. They thought I would stay quiet. They believed embarrassment would make me obedient. They assumed I cared more about approval than loyalty. But they didn't know something crucial about me. I had spent years learning their games, watching their hypocrisy, understanding the fragile foundation beneath their shining reputations. And that was when I leaned closer to Victoria and said something so calm, so precise, that her smile froze instantly. A simple sentence, a quiet reminder that secrets, when revealed at the right moment, can destroy far more than insults ever could. Victoria's fingers tightened slightly around her glass, the sparkle in her eyes flickering for the first time that evening. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't create a scene. I simply smiled and whispered, "It's interesting how concerned you are about financial stability, especially considering the audit your husband is currently facing." The words were soft, almost affectionate, but they landed like a thunderclap inside her mind. Her confident posture stiffened. The color in her face drained slowly, like someone had quietly dimmed the lights behind her perfect mask. She leaned closer to me, lowering her voice. "What are you talking about?" she asked, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to herself. I tilted my head slightly, maintaining the same calm expression. "Nothing serious." Yet, I replied gently, "But tax authorities usually don't appreciate hidden accounts." I watched the panic bloom in her eyes, subtle but undeniable. Victoria and her husband had always presented themselves as the perfect power couple, successful, untouchable, admired. But I had spent years observing the cracks behind their polished image. I knew things they assumed no one noticed. Meanwhile, Daniel remained unaware of the silent battle unfolding beside him. He was speaking to one of my father's partners, answering polite questions about his career with quiet confidence. Every word he spoke reflected integrity, something none of these people could purchase, no matter how much money they flaunted. I felt a wave of fierce protectiveness rise inside me. They had mistaken kindness for weakness. They believed humility meant inferiority. They forgot that dignity is often the strongest armor a person can wear. Victoria quickly excused herself, disappearing toward the bar where her husband stood laughing with guests. I watched her whisper urgently into his ear. His smile faded instantly. His hand froze mid-gesture. A flicker of fear passed between them, so quick most people wouldn't notice. But I noticed. I always noticed. Secrets are powerful currency in circles where reputation is everything. And my family, my elegant, respected, socially admired family, had far more secrets than they realized. The evening continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. I could sense tension moving quietly beneath the polite conversations. A few guests checked their phones more often than usual. My Aunt Eleanor's confident expression softened slightly, replaced by cautious curiosity. Even my father seemed distracted, watching me more closely as if trying to understand what had changed. They didn't hear the words I spoke, but they felt the consequences approaching, like distant thunder signaling a coming storm. Daniel gently touched my arm, concern visible in his eyes. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. I nodded, offering a reassuring smile. "I'm perfect," I whispered, and for the first time that evening, I truly meant it. Because I had stopped hoping they would accept him. I had stopped waiting for their approval. Instead, I decided they would learn respect in the only language they understood, consequences. But Victoria was only the beginning. There were more whispers hidden behind champagne glasses, more carefully protected reputations, more illusions waiting to collapse. And that night, I realized something powerful. They had underestimated me for years, believing I was too gentle to fight back, too polite to expose the truth, too controlled to create discomfort. They forgot one important thing. Patience is not weakness. Sometimes, patience is preparation, and I had been preparing for a very long time. As the evening deepened, the golden lights above the garden seemed less warm and more blinding, exposing every forced smile, every hidden fear. Conversations became slightly quieter whenever I passed by, as if my calm presence carried a silent warning. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't accused anyone publicly, yet the tension had begun to spread like invisible smoke. Victoria avoided my gaze completely, clinging to her husband's arm with a stiffness that betrayed her anxiety. Her earlier confidence had dissolved, replaced by the uneasy awareness that control had shifted. But I wasn't finished. I approached the long table where my Uncle Richard stood boasting about a recent business deal, his laughter loud, arrogant, certain of admiration. He had always loved being the center of attention, always believed power made him untouchable. I waited patiently for the right pause in conversation, then smiled politely. "Uncle Richard," I said warmly, "I heard the investors still haven't discovered why that contract was suddenly withdrawn last year." His laughter stopped mid-breath. A flicker of alarm crossed his face before he quickly masked it with a chuckle. "Oh, business complications," he replied casually, though his voice had lost its earlier strength. I tilted my head slightly, keeping my tone gentle. "Of course, complications tend to appear when documents are altered." The men around him exchanged subtle glances, confusion mixing with curiosity. Richard cleared his throat, adjusting his tie as if it had suddenly become too tight. He forced a smile, but the confidence he once wore like armor now looked fragile, cracked, vulnerable. The illusion of control was slipping, piece by piece. Across the garden, my mother was speaking with a group of elegant women, discussing wedding venues and guest lists as if nothing had changed. She hadn't defended Daniel earlier, hadn't even tried to soften the cruel remarks. Appearances had always mattered more to her than emotions. I walked toward her slowly, feeling years of quiet disappointment gathering into steady strength. She greeted me with a composed smile, unaware that the moment of polite silence between us was about to shatter. "I hope you're happy," she said carefully, her voice carrying the weight of restrained judgment. I looked directly into her eyes, calm but unyielding. "Happiness isn't measured by bank accounts," I replied softly. Her smile tightened slightly, but she remained silent. Then I added, just loud enough for her closest friends to hear, "At least Daniel's honesty has never been questioned in court." The air out us froze. One of the women lowered her glass slowly, sensing the shift in tone without fully understanding it. My mother's expression faltered for a brief second, a crack in her perfectly practiced composure. She knew exactly what I meant. Years ago, a legal dispute involving my father's company had nearly reached public attention before being quietly settled. Reputation had been preserved, but truth had been buried. My words were not an accusation. They were a reminder that perfection is often carefully edited, and edited stories can always be rewritten. The music continued to play, but now every note felt heavier, every conversation more cautious. I could see curiosity spreading through the guests, subtle but undeniable. My relatives were no longer laughing freely. Their confidence had been replaced by quiet calculation. They were beginning to understand something they had never considered before. The quiet girl they underestimated had grown into a woman who remembered everything. Daniel looked at me again, sensing the invisible tension building around us. "Charlotte," he whispered gently, concern mixed with admiration in his voice. "What's happening?" I squeezed his hand reassuringly. "Just balance," I answered calmly, because respect, like dignity, always finds its way back to those who refuse to surrender it. And tonight, balance had finally begun to shift. By the time the main course was served, the atmosphere had transformed completely. The same people who had laughed freely earlier were now speaking in careful tones, measuring every word as if the air itself had become fragile. Forks clinked softly against porcelain plates, but the elegant rhythm of the evening had been disrupted. My relatives exchanged glances filled with quiet suspicion, wondering how much I truly knew, wondering how much I might reveal next. Their confidence had always been built on the belief that no one would dare challenge them publicly. Tonight, that belief was crumbling. Daniel noticed the sudden politeness directed toward him. My father's business partner, who had earlier questioned his ambition, was now asking about his teaching methods with surprising interest. My Aunt Eleanor complimented his patience, her voice unusually warm. Even Uncle Richard attempted friendly conversation, though his forced smile revealed the discomfort he was trying desperately to hide. Respect had not suddenly grown inside them. Fear had simply replaced arrogance, and sometimes fear is the first step toward honesty. But the true turning point came when my father finally approached me. He stood tall, composed as always, yet something uncertain flickered behind his eyes. "Charlotte," he said quietly, guiding me a few steps away from the crowd, "you seem different tonight." I met his gaze calmly, refusing to lower my eyes the way I had done so many times before. "People reveal their true character under pressure," I replied gently. "Tonight has been very revealing." His jaw tightened slightly, the unspoken tension between us heavier than any argument we had ever had. He exhaled slowly, lowering his voice further. "Your family only wants security for you," he insisted, though the conviction in his tone felt rehearsed rather than genuine. I allowed a faint smile to appear. "Security built on disrespect isn't protection, it's control," I said quietly. For the first time in my life, he had no immediate response, because deep down, he understood the truth in my words. Wealth could influence perception, but it could never erase integrity. Meanwhile, whispers continued spreading among the guests. Victoria and her husband had already left earlier than expected, offering vague excuses about urgent commitments. Uncle Richard avoided discussing business entirely, suddenly uninterested in his usual boasting. My mother remained unusually silent, her polite smile now carrying a hint of unease. Their perfect evening had been disturbed not by scandal, but by the possibility of exposure. And sometimes, the fear of truth is far more powerful than the truth itself. Daniel gently pulled me aside near the balcony, concern softening his features. "You don't have to fight them for me," he said quietly. "I can handle a few careless jokes." His humility only strengthened my resolve. I looked into his eyes, steady and sincere. "You shouldn't have to tolerate disrespect to be accepted," I replied. "Love should never require humiliation as proof of loyalty." His silence held gratitude, but also surprise, as if he had never expected someone to defend him so fiercely. As the evening neared its end, the power dynamic had completely shifted. The same voices that mocked him earlier now spoke carefully, cautiously, almost respectfully. No dramatic confrontation had occurred. No public accusations had been made. Yet the message had been delivered clearly. Respect is not granted by wealth or status. It is earned through character, and those who attempt to humiliate others often forget their own lives are rarely as flawless as they pretend. But the most important moment, the moment that truly changed everything, was still waiting. Because sometimes revenge isn't loud. Sometimes it's a single sentence spoken at exactly the right time. As the final guests prepared to leave, the soft music faded into the background, replaced by the quiet rustle of expensive fabrics and polite farewells. The night air had grown cooler, yet the tension still lingered like invisible frost over every conversation. People hugged a little tighter, smiled a little longer, spoke a little more carefully. Appearances were still being maintained, but the illusion of superiority had already begun to crack. I could see it in the way they avoided direct eye contact with Daniel, suddenly unsure how to behave around the man they had mocked only hours before. Then came the final moment. My father raised his glass to thank everyone for attending, his voice steady, but lacking its usual commanding warmth. He spoke about family unity, future celebrations, shared happiness, words that sounded polished, but hollow after everything that had unfolded. As the guests listened politely, I felt Daniel's hand gently squeeze mine. His quiet presence reminded me why I had remained calm through every insult. This was never about proving anything to them. It was about protecting the dignity of the person who had never once tried to impress anyone. When my father finished speaking, he gestured for me to say a few words. The spotlight of attention shifted toward me, dozens of expectant faces waiting politely, unaware that the final piece of the evening was about to fall into place. I stepped forward slowly, feeling an unexpected sense of peace settle within me. My voice was calm, steady, clear enough to reach every corner of the silent garden. I know many of you worry about my future. I began gently, offering a small, composed smile. You wonder whether I've made a wise decision, whether love is enough without wealth. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing the quiet honesty beneath my polite tone. I paused briefly, allowing the silence to deepen before delivering the sentence that would linger in their minds long after the evening ended. The truth is, I didn't choose the richest man in the room, I said softly, my eyes briefly meeting Daniel's. I chose the only man here whose reputation doesn't depend on secrets staying hidden. The silence that followed felt heavier than any applause could have been. No accusations, no names mentioned, just truth, placed gently in the center of the room like a mirror no one wanted to face. Some guests lowered their eyes, others forced polite smiles. My relatives remained perfectly still, trapped between dignity and discomfort, because they understood exactly what I meant. Their laughter from earlier now echoed differently in their minds. No longer harmless, no longer clever. As the evening finally ended, something had changed permanently. No dramatic arguments had occurred, no public scandals exposed. Yet respect had quietly been restored. Daniel was no longer the outsider they pitied. He was the man who stood untouched by hidden compromises. And I was no longer the obedient daughter seeking approval. I had become the woman who understood that loyalty is more valuable than status, and integrity is a wealth no inheritance can provide. Sometimes revenge isn't about destroying others. Sometimes it's about revealing who never needed pretending in the first place. Because karma doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply waits for the perfect moment to whisper the truth.